Hi, this is a brief little video on Illustrator in general, kind of how it looks and what you can do in it. And then we are going to work with some shapes and creating objects using those shapes. So when you first open Illustrator, it should look something like this. Obviously, I've already opened Illustrator, so I have some documents in here, but yours will look something like this. And then all we're going to do is we're going to open this file here that I had for you in Classroom. So I'll click on that to open it. Now that we're in Illustrator, I can show you a little bit about the kind of how it looks. It's pretty similar to Photoshop if you'll notice. We have this application bar up at the top here. Yours will look just a little bit different because I'm working on a Mac and you're on a PC, but essentially most of the things should work the same way. So things are called a little bit different names in Illustrator than they are in some cases in Photoshop. This is one of them. So right here across the top under the application bar, you have your control panel. So that's the options bar in Photoshop. Here in Illustrator, it's the control panel, but everything else is pretty much the same. So we have our tools panel over here on the left-hand side where all of our tools live. If yours don't look exactly like mine do, it's a possibility that your workspace could have been changed for some reason or another. So make sure if that is the case, come up here and click. Mine says Essentials, yours might say a different word up here, and click on Essentials. You can also access that information by going to Window, Workspace, and clicking on Essentials. So if you don't see yours right up here, you can get to it a different way. Mine is set to Essentials, so I'm good to go. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to View and Fit All in Window. So I'll just fit everything in here. All of our layers work essentially the same way in Illustrator as they do in Photoshop, essentially the same way. I mean, you can stack up your layers, and according to the way they are stacked up and the order of them, that will determine how they're viewed. So they work similarly. All of my other options I have over here. If I click on one of these, it'll pull out the panel. So I have those available here. They just kind of dock themselves nicely into this little panel over here. Okay, so that's essentially the workspace. Your best bet might just be to open up Illustrator and play around a little bit and use the tools and familiarize yourself with the way everything's set up. That's probably the best way to learn about it. And we're actually going to do a lot of that stuff here with this exercise, just so you know. So we'll kind of start with the very basics and we'll work our way up from there. So now that we're in Illustrator, I have this drawing shapes document open. I like to step back a couple of steps. I went to View and Fit in Window just so that I was able to see the entire document in my window and it's centered and everything. So you could zoom in using the Control plus on your keyboard if you want to, or go to View and zoom in there. So you can access that information a bunch of different ways. Okay, so let's get down to drawing some shapes. So we're going to start out with this rectangle shape. It's a rounded rectangle, right? Or a rounded square, actually, to be more precise. What we're going to do is we are going to draw the same object that's here on the left over here in the right-hand side within these little outlines. So our first thing that we need to do is make sure that our fill and stroke colors are set the way we want them. The fill is right. I want it to be white because I want my rectangle to be filled with white. The stroke, however, I want to change that so that there's no stroke. I don't want an outline around my object. In Photoshop, this would be our foreground and background color. They're in the same essentially the same spot in Photoshop versus Illustrator. But in Illustrator, they're fill and stroke color. In Photoshop, they are foreground and background color. Just so you know, that's just a minor little difference. So now I am going to go up and I'm going to choose my rectangle tool. So my rectangle tool is right here. You'll notice there is a rounded rectangle tool, but we're going to choose the regular rectangle tool and I'll show you how to round the corners yourself. Okay, so now I can just click and drag and make a rectangle of any size that I want. Illustrator works the same way as Photoshop does, so if you want to constrain the proportions and create a perfect rectangle, also known as a square, just hold down the Shift key. So right now I'm just holding the Shift key and I can only make a square. I can't make a rectangle. That's not perfectly square. So I'm just going to click and drag out to about the size of that little outline under there. And I'm going to release my mouse button before I release the shift key, and there we go. That way I don't have any problems with it going out of proportion as I release. Okay, so now I have my square created. You can see these little circles in each corner. That's a little widget. So what that does, and you can see when I mouse over it, I see that little arc there. That is telling me that I can round over my corners. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You can go to, I would go somewhere around 0.3 inches. So somewhere like that. If it's not exactly that, that's fine. Don't worry about it. And it's in about the right spot. If I wanted to move this, I could just click and drag now and move it around. Or I can nudge it using the arrows on my keyboard. So I can nudge it up a little bit using the up arrow on my keyboard. I can nudge it down using the down arrow. Same thing left and right. That works the same way as in Photoshop. Okay, so there is my rounded rectangle. Pretty easy to make, right? So now let's move down and we're going to create a triangle. And if you'll notice, as I'm working around in my document, you see these bright pink lines show up, those magenta lines. Those are smart guides. So if you want to be able to see those, and they really do come in handy, they help you line things up. For this project, it won't matter a lot yet, but once we get over here to this robot, it might matter a little bit. So all I need to do in order to view those, if you don't already, is go to View and Smart Guides and make sure there's a check mark next to Smart Guides. And then if that's the case, then you should have those available. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we are going to make our triangle. I'm going to choose my polygon tool in the Tools panel. So I just click on my tool over here, click down to Polygon tool. You can actually create a triangle using either the Polygon tool or the Star tool. For this job, we're going to use the Polygon tool. So I click on that, and I come over here, and I can just click and drag out, and mine is actually making a triangle. Yours might not start making a triangle, however. If yours is making a polygon with more sides than 3, don't worry about it. Well, I'll show you how to fix that. What I'm going to do actually though, as I create my triangle, is I'm going to approximate the size. So I am going to drag that down so it's about the same size as my outline. If I want to move my triangle as I create it, I can press and hold the space bar, drag down with my mouse, and then release the space bar. The other thing that I would like you to do is press and hold the shift key. That way my, as you can see, the bottom line on my triangle is constrained so that it's directly horizontal rather than releasing the shift key and letting it rotate around in whichever direction. So again, hold the shift key and then size it approximately like the triangle is there. If it's not perfectly the same size, don't worry about it. So I'm pressing and holding the shift key, and right now, because I'm moving this as I'm creating that shape, I'm pressing and holding the space bar. So I'm pressing and holding both the shift and the space bar as I press and hold my mouse button. So it's a bunch of stuff to hold on to. Okay, so here we are. If yours created a polygon, what you can do, we have another widget built in right here. So this little diamond on the side, once I mouse over that, I see that plus and minus sign. So what I can do is I can click and drag that down and I get more sides. So I can go up to 11 sides, or I can click and drag it up and get to 3 sides. And that's exactly what we want. So if yours started out as like a 6-sided polygon, go ahead and click and drag that little widget, that little widget, and that should increase or decrease the number of sides depending on which direction you drag it in. That's a new feature in this latest version of Illustrator, so it's pretty handy. Okay, so now we know how to make rounded rectangles and we know how to make triangles. We're going to work our way down here and we're going to make a circle, triangle, and 2 rectangles to make the hat or the top of this guy's head. So now we're just going to go up and choose our ellipse tool. And now this is a circle rather than a flattened circle. Okay, so not, we don't want a flattened circle. So in order to constrain the proportions again, I can hold down the shift key as I'm creating my circle to move it again, press and hold the space bar and release. Okay, so there is my circle. To make my triangle, I can do the exact same thing as what I did earlier. So the polygon tool, I can click and drag out a polygon. If I want the bottom line to be straight across, I hold down the shift key as I make it. And it's not in the right spot, but I'll move it down. It's also not the right shape, exactly the right size, so I'm going to change that just a little bit and I'll move it into the right spot with my mouse. If I want to nudge it over, I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard. So I'm going to put that in about that spot for right now. I might move it or resize it later. I'll see what happens. Okay, so now I have my triangle. I need to move on down and make my rectangle. So all I'm doing is I'm clicking and dragging out a rectangle, and there I go. I have my first rectangle. One thing that I would like to show you, kind of an easier way to, like right now I have to make two rectangles that are the same essential shape. Their size is just a little bit different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to my selection tool. So that one in the top left in my tools panel, I can also get to it by hitting the V on my keyboard, V as in Victor. That's my keyboard shortcut. So I have my selection tool selected. What I can do now is put my mouse right over that rectangle. I'm not pressing down on my mouse key yet, on my mouse button yet. I'm going to hold down the Alt button on my keyboard until I see those two arrows. I see that black arrow and that white arrow. Now I know that if I click and drag from there, I'm going to make a copy. So that's exactly what we want. So again, my mouse is over my rectangle. I'm going to hold down the Alt key on my keyboard until I see the two arrows, and now I'm going to click and drag that down. And I've just made an exact copy of what I already had, and that's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to do. I just now need to pull out either side so that it matches up with my outline. And there we go. That's an easy way to make a copy of something. That would work the same way for any of these shapes. So all I need to do is hold down the Alt key on my keyboard. And actually mine isn't popping up with those arrows right away for some reason. But now it is. So I'm holding down the Alt key. I see those little arrows, click and drag that over, and I'm making a copy. So I could do that same thing over and over and over. So if if you're working on making some sort of pattern where there's the same shape over and over and over, that's definitely a way easier and way faster way to make that shape rather than going through the process of selecting your tool and creating the shape over and over and over. Okay, there you go. There's your brief little introduction into the shapes in Illustrator. In the next video, we are going to use those shapes to create this robot.